I'm Steve Hargadon. Some 8 or 9 years ago, I started a project called Classroom 2.0, which was one of the first social networks, modern social networks for educators. Since then, I've devoted myself in a lot of ways to providing spaces for educators to connect with and teach each other. So, including virtual communities and online conferences and physical events that gather educators together. You know, it's really interesting. I can remember doing a session at EduBloggerCon, our all-day unconference at ISTE, now called Hack Education, but we did it some years ago, and it was on agency, and I think 3 people showed up. I don't think the word was current then. I've looked back at the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, and I've been really interested at the material around self-directed learning. I'm not sure that I've noticed the word agency used in the same way that it's being used now, but I think it's a really positive trend. And I think that it's a really interesting thing to think about the distinction between the desire for the student to be directing their own learning and the desire for the institution to direct it. And I don't want to be too black and white here, but our language around learning as a liberating experience has typically always revolved around helping the individual become self-motivated and self-directed. I think what's intriguing is that we would have any kind of other arguments related to that. The sort of this idea that the school or the organization should determine what an individual learns, much more like a factory output. And so we exist in this world of language around education as a liberating experience, and yet practices that provide an enormous amount of compliance requirements and don't really, I think in most cases, leave students believing that they're agents, that they're independent, and they're capable of that independence. So again, I think for me, it's sort of critical, right? Ultimately, if you want a healthy society, you want individuals who are learning and capable and then able to work on problems, create solutions, be creative, and do interesting things. So, that we would have any other kind of expectation for education is interesting, right? I mean, the core for me of an education that creates both individual capacity and benefit to the community would be a lot, I think, like the transcendentalists, who believed that the strengthening of the individual strengthened the community. I think where we see the opposite of that is a desire for a predictable outcome and to be in control, right? And so if you look at the sort of the start of the modern education era, you have a lot of circumstances in the 1920s and prior to that with immigrant populations, a concern about having a workforce that will follow orders. You had concerns just about the immigrant populations as a whole in terms of the structure of society and safety and other issues. And so I think what happened is there's a building of a system which is largely around creating compliance and control rather than building the individual capacity. And that's a simplified history, but I think it becomes really evident after the 1960s when there was a great fear about what happens in a culture when there's so much independent thinking. Exactly. But there are 2 reports that come out, one about education and one about society as a whole. And there's a very clear moment at which there's a desire to regain control. Television had shown the reality of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of questioning. There was a lot of independent thinking, and that was, frankly, quite scary. I think as a period of time. I know my dad lived through it and was very scared by it. And so it led to increasingly measuring education by sort of top-down compliance measures. So for me, intrinsic motivation is at the core of learning and should be. If you look at all the classic quotations on education, I think that's basically, the intent of so many very sort of thoughtful and wise people in describing what happens to individuals as they become more educated. I mean, I think the less that we see intrinsic motivation as a part of that process, the more that we're actually talking about education as social control. I think we see these cultures in a lot of different places in a lot of schools. There's a fair amount of freedom within some core structure. There's an openness about teaching the students self-control and self-motivation. There's a fair amount of independent work. Have everything from as sort of wildly unstructured as Sudbury schools to sort of more Montessori-like or independent learning centers. And so there are going to be a variety of ways in which people accomplish this, but I would say sort of at the heart of these schools are thoughtful, engaged, active students, right, who are pursuing interesting things and don't need as much kind of a control environment. I think the opposite of it would be desks in a row and a teacher standing in front, with a chalkboard. We were joking the other day that if you sort of wanted to measure the health of a school culture, you'd go into the teacher's lounge and you'd see kind of what the conversations were about. And so if the conversations are about kind of controlling, measuring kinds of things, or are they about liberating, kind of encouraging things, then that might be one way of sort of determining where on the spectrum the school lies. But ultimately, the idea that students drive their own learning is going to pretty significantly create a culture in a learning environment that's probably manifests much more like we would imagine employees at Google. Maybe that's a way to describe it. I think this is a really interesting topic, right? Because we use the language of self-direction, but we have this sort of dichotomy. It's the difference between the Socratic view of bringing out the best in each individual and the Platonic Republic view, right, of the state determining what students need to know in order for the students to serve the state. And I think there's a dilemma there. I mean, we have an inherent dilemma about whether or not we believe that we're a collective of individuals, and individual strength makes the society stronger, or if we're a collective and the individuals are secondary to that. And it's not a small dilemma, right? It really has a lot of impact in terms of how we think about moving forward. We talk about being competitive, that schooling helps our nation become competitive. And it's hard to imagine that that's the case if students aren't actually individually competent and capable and then working together to figure things out. It's a little bit of an illusion that everybody is sort of mandated from the top down exactly what they're supposed to learn and then what they're supposed to do. And those kinds of societies, they implode, but they also provide sort of very scary opportunities for more totalitarian thinking. So, again, I think not to blow this out of proportion, but I think it's a very significant human question, and it's manifest in the way we think about schooling. And I think the reason that there is this tension and the reason that it's manifest is that we are both at one and the same time individuals and then parts of a collective society, and we are influenced by those around us, and propaganda does work, right? I mean, being manipulated by symbols and emotions is a very common way of getting people to do things. So it's not so sort of black and white, but I think as a society we have to make a choice. And the choice is, what do we really care about? Yes, it's really easy for us to sort of succumb and be part of a compliance situation and to build our schools that way and to use testing as this measurement that goes all the way up to the top as to whether or not we're succeeding. That's tempting because it works. People go along with it, and we can build justifications for it. It works in the sense that people will accept it as a model of human society. But ultimately, I think if we take a long view of history and if we sort of talk deeply about what we really want to accomplish, it doesn't work in terms of creating a healthy culture. And I think we've seen that in business, and we've seen that, the total quality movement for sure, where increasingly they figured out how to push measurement and decision making down to the lowest possible levels in order to accomplish good things. It's sort of like the person on the assembly line who can pull the chain and stop the assembly line. So at some level, we do live in both worlds, and we have to balance that. So ultimately, if our goal is for students to be responsible for their own learning, if the health of a society is the aggregation of the learning habits of the individuals in the society, then what we should be doing is sort of making learning visible, as Hattie from Australia says, right, or New Zealand. We should be helping students to be managing and measuring their own learning. And I think for those of us who do learning for a living, we've sort of figured that out. We figured out, how do I learn best, when and where? Is it reading? Is it writing? What are the ways in which I express I curate and express my thoughts, and how do I help avoid traps? And what are the things I do to be a good thinker? And we don't talk a lot about that, but these are very sort of tangible things that we need to be thinking about helping students do. And ultimately, the first way we do that is modeling it, and then the second way is being aware of the need for this as a visible generative process, right? That ultimately there's some kind of period of reflection or time at which we actually spent thinking about and talking with students about their own self-direction. It's not going to happen without it being an open conversation. So until we actually declare this is our end goal, self-direction or agency, it's going to be very hard to accomplish that, because it has to be transparent and open for it to actually be effective.